In the dead of a Memphis night, long after the tourists and the faithful had retreated, Elvis Presley would sometimes give his own cars secret code names. The Dragon for one, the Centurion for another. It was a phantom game he played against his own security. A desperate whisper of a plan to slip past his own guards, to just drive. To feel the anonymous rush of asphalt under rubber, a freedom he had purchased and then promptly lost. He almost never made it past the gates. But this strange, secret ritual begs a far darker question. When a man builds a fortress to keep the world out, what happens to his soul when he realizes he has, in fact, locked himself in? What is the true cost of a crown when the kingdom becomes a cage? The year is 1957. The ink is barely dry on the deed to Graceland. At first, it was a sanctuary, a southern haven with sprawling lawns and stately columns, a place for his mother to finally rest her feet. Fans would come, of course. They would gather at the gates. A constant, loving vigil. Elvis would wander down, sign autographs, chat with the girls, a king holding court with his adoring subjects. It was a symbiotic ritual, a confirmation of his status and their devotion. He was accessible, he was real. But the crowds didn't just stay. They grew. They multiplied into a relentless, suffocating wave. The lawn became a trampled mud pit. The curious became the obsessive. They climbed the stone walls, peered through windows, stole souvenirs from the clothesline. The love was becoming a siege. The sanctuary was becoming a target. And so, the famous gates were commissioned. Wrought iron, scrolled with musical notes and stylized silhouettes of the king himself. They were beautiful, a work of art, but they were also a statement, a line drawn in the Tennessee soil. The open hand of the people's king was slowly, inexorably, clenching into a fist. He wasn't just keeping them out anymore, he was sealing himself in. The world outside those gates was a maelstrom of his own creation. Every gas station stop, every diner, every movie theater became a riot scene. A simple walk down the street was a fantasy, a memory from another life. He was the most famous man on the planet, and the loneliest. Inside Graceland, the silence began to have a weight. The sprawling rooms, once a symbol of success, started to feel cavernous, empty. The laughter of his friends and family could fill them, but it was a curated sound, an invited noise. It wasn't the organic, unpredictable symphony of the real world. He had traded the world for an echo of it, and the price of that transaction was only just beginning to come due. The cage wasn't just brick and iron. It was becoming a state of mind. One evening, staring out a second-story window at the endless procession of cars crawling past on the highway, a friend asked him what he was looking at. Elvis didn't turn. He just kept staring into the darkness, at the headlights of free people going to free places. "I was just watching the world go by," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was a profound admission. He was no longer a part of it. He was a spectator to the life he used to live, watching from a velvet-lined prison box. The initial comfort of security was beginning to curdle into the cold dread of isolation. The gates were meant to protect the king, but they were imprisoning the man. And the architect of this gilded prison, the man who held the key, was not Elvis himself. It was a portly, cigar-chomping showman who saw the cage not as a tragedy, but as a priceless asset. The man was Colonel Tom Parker, and his rehook wasn't just a new twist, it was the tightening of the chains. Parker understood a fundamental, brutal truth of stardom. An icon is more valuable when it is scarce. A myth is more powerful when it is unseen. By keeping Elvis behind the gates, Parker wasn't just protecting his client. He was controlling the supply of a global phenomenon. Every glimpse of Elvis had to be purchased, ticketed, and packaged. Parker's chokehold was absolute, woven into the very fabric of Elvis's life, with contracts that were masterpieces of control. He took his 50%, a figure unheard of then and now, but his cut wasn't just from the money. It was a cut of Elvis's freedom. The infamous Hollywood years were Parker's grand design. 3 pictures a year, 3 soundtracks a year, a relentless, soul-crushing assembly line of flimsy plots and forgettable songs. Elvis, who had shaken the world to its foundations with the raw power of rock and roll, was now crooning to crustaceans on a beach in a G-rated travelogue. He hated it. He despised the scripts, the lazy songwriting, the sheer indignity of it all. He was an artist, a revolutionary, and Parker had turned him into a predictable, profitable commodity. He would rage in his trailer, kick furniture, plead for a real role, a serious script like A Star is Born or West Side Story. He yearned to test his acting chops, to be seen as more than a singing jukebox in a convertible. Parker's response was always the same, a calm, dismissive wave of his cigar. "Why would you want to do a serious picture?" he'd ask. the question itself an insult. "We're making a fortune with these." The cage was now lined with celluloid. Elvis was trapped in a repeating 2-hour loop of his own manufactured image. The world saw the smiling, handsome star on screen, but behind the scenes, a part of him was dying with every take. He was no longer driving the narrative of his own life. He was an actor, playing a character named Elvis Presley in a film directed by Colonel Parker. This creative imprisonment had a devastating psychological effect. It fostered a deep-seated insecurity. Was he any good without the formula? Was he still the lightning in a bottle from the 50s? Or just a well-oiled machine? The world tours he dreamed of, the chance to connect with his international fans, were perpetually denied. Parker, a man without a passport and a past he was keen to keep buried, claimed it was too expensive, too risky. The truth was simpler. A world tour was unpredictable. A Hollywood soundstage was not. He was a global superstar who had never performed outside of North America. It was an absurdity that gnawed at him. He would see footage of the Beatles conquering the world and feel a pang of professional jealousy and artistic hunger. He knew he could do it. He knew the fans were there. But the bars of his cage were forged from Parker's contracts and his own misplaced loyalty. The isolation deepened. He couldn't go out. His work was unfulfilling. His artistic instincts were being systematically suppressed. So he turned inward, pulling the walls of his sanctuary even tighter around him. And he populated it with the only people he could trust. A band of brothers who would become both his lifeline and the very guards of his prison. They were the Memphis Mafia. They were his court, his entourage, his shield, a brotherhood of cousins and old friends from Memphis, who surrounded him 24 hours a day. On the surface, it was the ultimate dream, to bring your hometown buddies along for the ride of a lifetime. They were his confidants, his sparring partners, his practical joke accomplices. They protected him from the grasping hands of the public and the endless parade of sycophants. In the suffocating bubble of fame, they were his only source of air, a slice of normalcy in a life that was anything but. But the loyalty came at a cost. Their entire existence, their salaries, their lavish lifestyles, depended on one man. Their primary, unspoken duty was to keep Elvis happy, to keep the machine running. This meant insulating him, not just from threats, but from reality itself. Bad news was filtered. Negative reviews were hidden. Uncomfortable truths were smoothed over. The world outside Graceland became a distant rumor, reported back to the king by his loyal foot soldiers. If Elvis wanted to go bowling at 3 in the morning, they made it happen. If he wanted to rent out the entire Fairgrounds amusement park after midnight just to ride the Zippin' Pippin roller coaster alone, they placed the call. If he decided he wanted to fly to Denver for a peanut butter and banana sandwich, the Lisa Marie was fueled and ready on the tarmac. They were enablers of the highest order, constructing a hermetically sealed reality where every whim was law. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Elvis, starved for genuine human connection, was surrounded by men whose livelihoods depended on his continued isolation. They became the gatekeepers. Old friends from before the fame would be turned away, deemed a security risk or an unwelcome reminder of a life he could no longer lead. Potential romantic partners were vetted, managed, and often dismissed if they threatened the delicate equilibrium of the court. There's a telling story of a young woman Elvis was genuinely interested in, an outsider who wasn't part of the Hollywood scene. She challenged him, talked to him about books and ideas, not just his fame. Some of the inner circle saw her as a threat. They began to subtly poison the well. "She's just using you, they'd say. "She's talking to the press." It wasn't true. But in the paranoid echo chamber of the golden cage, the seeds of doubt took root. The relationship withered. The cage remained secure. He was the king, but he was also the provider. And this dynamic created an uncrossable chasm. They could be his friends, but they could never be his equals. He was their boss. This fundamental imbalance meant that true, honest criticism was impossible. No one could tell the king that his fly was down, or that his last movie was a dud, or that he was taking too many pills. To challenge the king was to risk exile from the kingdom. And so, the isolation became psychological. He was surrounded by people, yet perpetually, profoundly alone. He was the sun around which they all orbited, but no one could get close enough to see the darkness consuming him from within. The world contracted until it was just the walls of Graceland, the sound stages of Hollywood, and the hotel suites of Las Vegas. And because the day was the domain of the public, the king was forced to conquer the only territory left to him, the night. The night became his kingdom. It was the only time the world outside held its breath, the only time the siege at his gates relented. The sun was his enemy. It brought the crowds, the demands, the blinding glare of the flashbulbs. So Elvis Presley became a creature of the dark, a nocturnal phantom haunting his own life. His sleep schedule inverted, a rebellion against the clockwork demands of a world he could no longer join. He would sleep until the late afternoon, rising as the sun began to set, his day beginning when everyone else's was ending. Graceland would come alive after midnight. The clack of billiard balls, the roar of a movie projector, the chords of a gospel song on the piano. These were the sounds of the king's waking hours. He turned his home into a private resort. He had his own movie theater, and a runner would be dispatched to the local cinema to pick up the latest prints. He would watch movies for hours, sometimes the same one, over and over, deconstructing scenes, admiring the craft of actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean, men who had the artistic freedom he craved. It was a strange, artificial existence. He recreated the world inside his walls because he couldn't experience it outside. He missed the simple pleasure of going to the movies with a date, of buying popcorn, of sitting with an anonymous crowd. So he brought the mountain to Muhammad, but it was a hollow victory. The magic of the cinema is the shared experience, and he was always the only true member of the audience. The laughter from his friends was a performance for his benefit. His nocturnal adventures became legendary. The rented-out amusement parks were a staple, a desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of his lost youth. He and his entourage would descend on the empty park at 2 a.m., the roller coasters and bumper cars humming to life just for them. For a few hours, under the lonely glow of the park lights, he could pretend to be a normal young man having fun with his friends, but the illusion was paper thin. He once stopped a roller coaster at the very top of its highest peak, looking down at the sleeping city of Memphis. The wind was whipping around him. The park was silent except for the creak of the machinery. And in that moment, surrounded by the trappings of fun, he was struck by a profound sense of emptiness. He was the king of this fabricated world, the master of a ghost carnival. The laughter and screams of his friends below sounded distant, unreal. He was on top of the world, and he had never felt more alone. This upside-down life began to take a physical and mental toll. Living in a world without sun, a world of artificial light and perpetual twilight, warped his sense of time and reality. Paranoia began to creep in. The darkness that was once his refuge started to feel menacing. Every shadow in the long hallways of Graceland seemed to hold a threat. He became obsessed with security, with surveillance, with the loyalty of those around him. The cage was no longer just the physical walls. It was the prison of his own mind. He needed a way out, not a physical escape. He knew that was impossible, but a spiritual one. He needed something to believe in, a truth that was bigger than the suffocating reality of his fame. He wasn't just looking for a hobby. He was looking for salvation. And he began his search in the most unlikely of places. A hidden library of forbidden knowledge, tucked away in a quiet corner of his gilded cage. In a small room upstairs at Graceland, away from the raucous energy of the downstairs dens, a secret world was taking shape. It was a library, but not one filled with bestsellers or popular fiction. The shelves were groaning under the weight of hundreds of books on religion, philosophy, and esoteric mysticism. The King James Bible sat next to the Bhagavad Gita. The Tibetan Book of the Dead leaned against Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. This was Elvis's private university, his sanctuary of the soul. This spiritual quest was the most sincere and desperate journey of his life. It began with his hairdresser, Larry Geller, who introduced him to a world of thought far beyond the confines of Memphis Pentecostalism. For Elvis, it was like a floodgate opening. Here were ideas that addressed the profound questions that haunted his sleepless nights. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of this bizarre, isolated life I am leading? He devoured the books with a ravenous hunger, underlining passages, making notes in the margins, seeking a cosmic blueprint that could make sense of his own chaotic existence. He saw his life, his fame, as a divine test. He believed his voice was a gift from God, and that he was meant to use it for a higher purpose than singing about teddy bears or girls in bikinis. He would hold impromptu spiritual seminars with the Memphis Mafia, reading passages aloud, trying to share the epiphanies he was having. He spoke of cosmic consciousness, of numerology, of a reality beyond the physical plane. For a time, it gave him a sense of peace, a feeling of control. If his earthly cage was inescapable, perhaps he could transcend it spiritually. He began to meditate. He believed he could leave his own body, that he could heal people with his touch. There are credible accounts from his inner circle of moments when he seemed to possess a strange, calming energy, of a focused power that was both unnerving and deeply compelling. But his spiritual search was a direct threat to the powers that controlled his life. Colonel Parker viewed it with utter contempt. To him, this philosophical exploration was a dangerous distraction. It didn't sell tickets. It didn't produce gold records. It made Elvis unpredictable. All that talk of spirits and astrology, Parker would grumble, is just going to confuse the fans. He ordered Geller to stop bringing Elvis the books, seeing the hairdresser not as a spiritual guide, but as a corrupting influence. Even the Memphis Mafia, for the most part, was baffled. They were men of the material world. They humored him, listened to his late-night sermons, but few truly understood or shared his passion. To them, it was just another of the king's phases. This lack of understanding only deepened his isolation. He had found what he believed to be the key to the universe, and he was surrounded by people who just wanted to know when the next flight to Vegas was. The conflict came to a head. Parker, along with Elvis's own father, Vernon, staged an intervention. They presented him with an ultimatum. It was either this weird stuff or his career. They saw his spiritual awakening as a form of madness, a threat to the multi-million-dollar industry that was Elvis Presley. Cornered, heartbroken, and deeply confused, Elvis made a choice. He chose the cage. He agreed to put the books away, to focus on the work. He threw the library onto a bonfire in the Graceland backyard, a symbolic surrender of his spiritual quest. He watched the pages of wisdom and hope curl into black ash, and a part of his spirit died with them. The one true escape route he had found had been barricaded. There was only one destination left on the map, a city of neon and false promises that would become the final, most luxurious wing of his prison: Las Vegas. Las Vegas in 1969 was a desert mirage, a glittering oasis of sin and spectacle. And at its heart was the newly built International Hotel, the largest in the world. It was here that Elvis would stage the greatest comeback in music history. And it was here that his golden cage would be perfected, reinforced with steel, velvet, and an endless supply of prescription medication. The deal was unprecedented. A residency that would span years, making him the undisputed king of Vegas. For Colonel Parker, it was the ultimate dream. His boy, his prize asset, in one place, easily managed, churning out cash night after night. For Elvis, at first, it was a resurrection. After the creative wasteland of Hollywood, the stage was his salvation. He was electric, a primal force of nature unleashed. The jumpsuits, the karate moves, the powerhouse voice that had been muted for a decade, all came roaring back. He was connecting with a live audience again, feeding off their energy, proving to the world and to himself that the fire had not gone out. Those early Vegas shows were legendary, a testament to his unparalleled talent. But the triumph was fleeting. The residency became a grind. 2 shows a night, a dinner show, and a midnight show. For weeks on end, it was a brutal, relentless schedule. The setlist rarely changed. The jokes with the band became stale. The resurrection was becoming another assembly line, more glamorous than the Hollywood one, but just as soul-destroying. His world shrank to a single building. He lived in the Imperial Suite on the 30th floor, a palatial penthouse with panoramic views of the city he could never explore. The suite was his home, his dressing room, his entire universe. He would descend in a private service elevator directly to the backstage area, perform his show, and ascend back to his penthouse cage. He could go weeks without breathing unfiltered desert air. The hotel was a fortress designed to keep him in. The casino floor, with its endless chaos and crowds, was strictly off-limits. Special security details ensured he was never seen by the general public outside of the showroom. He was the biggest attraction in the city, but he was also its most famous prisoner. The grueling schedule demanded an inhuman level of energy. To get up for 2 high-octane performances a night, he began to rely on uppers. To come down from the adrenaline rush and the roaring crowds to the deafening silence of his suite at 3 a.m., he needed downers to sleep. This was the beginning of the vicious chemical cycle that would dominate the rest of his life. Doctors, employed by the Vegas machine, were all too willing to provide him with whatever he needed. They were not healers. They were mechanics, tasked with keeping the star attraction running at all costs. His body became a chemistry experiment. The Memphis Mafia, loyal and ever-present, became the dispensers of these prescriptions, a pill schedule dictating his waking and sleeping hours. They thought they were helping him cope, helping him survive the impossible demands of his job. They didn't realize they were methodically building the walls of a new, more insidious cage, a chemical one. The physical and mental decline was gradual, then terrifyingly swift. His weight fluctuated wildly. His on-stage performances became erratic. Sometimes he was brilliant, lucid, in complete command. Other times he was bloated, slurring his words, forgetting lyrics, rambling incoherently between songs. The audience, blinded by love and nostalgia, would still cheer, but those backstage knew the truth. The king was crumbling. The cage was no longer just around him. It was inside him. His own body was becoming the prison, and the sentence was becoming unbearable. The man who had once been a symbol of vibrant, rebellious youth was now a prisoner of his own deteriorating health. The glittering jumpsuits, once a symbol of a warrior king, became a means of hiding a bloated, medicated body. The iconic sneer was replaced by a weary, sometimes confused, gaze. He was still performing, still going through the motions, but the light in his eyes was dimming. The nightly battle was no longer with an adoring audience. It was with his own exhaustion, his own addictions, his own despair. His isolation in the Vegas penthouse was absolute. He would spend days in his bedroom, the windows blacked out, reading his spiritual books in secret, trying to find the path he had abandoned. He was surrounded by opulence, gold fixtures, velvet ropes, an army of staff catering to his every need. But it was the loneliness of a mausoleum. He would complain of physical ailments, stomach pains, vision problems, insomnia, all symptoms of the brutal pharmaceutical cocktail he was consuming. There were moments of clarity, terrifying glimpses of the man he used to be, trapped inside the wreckage. He would sometimes rage at his own reflection, at the bloated face staring back at him from the mirror. He would talk about firing the colonel, about moving to a remote island, about starting over. He dreamed of a simple life, a life where he could walk into a store, where he could sit in a park, where he could be a father to his daughter without the constant glare of the world's attention. But it was too late. The machine was too big. The dependencies, financial, emotional, chemical, were too deep. The cage was self-perpetuating. To stop the show would mean financial ruin for dozens of people who relied on him. To stop the pills would mean facing an unbearable reality without a chemical shield. He was trapped in a golden feedback loop of performance and prescription. The return to Graceland between Vegas stints was no longer a refuge. It was just a different wing of the same prison. The old nocturnal games had lost their thrill. The late-night movies felt like a replay of a life he was no longer living. His world had become four walls, whether they were in Memphis or Las Vegas. He became increasingly obsessed with law enforcement, collecting police badges, befriending officers. It was a strange fixation, but psychologically, it made perfect sense. He, a man with no real power over his own life, was drawn to the symbols of authority and control. He, a prisoner, was fascinated by the men who held the keys. It was a way to feel powerful in a life where he was utterly powerless. His relationships became casualties of the cage. His marriage to Priscilla crumbled under the weight of his fame, his infidelity, and his increasingly erratic lifestyle. He was a man incapable of true intimacy because he was no longer a true, accessible person. He was an idea, an icon, a business. Any woman who entered his orbit was entering the prison with him, and few could endure the suffocating isolation. In his final months, the lines blurred completely. The man who had once embodied life itself seemed to be actively courting death. His diet was famously self-destructive. His consumption of pills reached staggering levels. It wasn't a conscious desire to die, perhaps, but a reckless indifference to living. The struggle was over. The fight to escape, the search for meaning, the rage against the machine or it had all been exhausted. All that was left was the desire for peace, for an end to the noise, an end to the pain, an end to the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley. On the 16th of August, 1977, the silence in the upstairs rooms of Graceland became permanent. The king was found, not on a stage in a blaze of glory, but on the floor of his bathroom, the victim of a body that could no longer sustain the war being waged within it. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but that was just the final, clinical syllable in a long, tragic sentence. The true cause of death was the cage. It had finally squeezed the life out of him. The world erupted in a global outpouring of grief. They mourned the loss of the icon, the voice, the image. They mourned the boy from Tupelo who had changed the world. But what few understood, what few could truly grasp, was the death of the prisoner. They cried for the king, but the man had been gone for a long, long time, lost somewhere behind the gates, the movie screens, the Vegas stage lights, and the wall of prescription fog. Looking back, the cage wasn't built in a day. It was constructed piece by piece, with every screaming fan, every million-dollar contract, every enabling friend, every prescribed pill. It was built with love and obsession, with greed and loyalty, with good intentions and terrible consequences. Elvis himself had helped build it, believing it was a fortress to protect him. He didn't realize until it was too late that the most beautiful, opulent cages are still cages, and there is no escape. He paid the ultimate price for his crown. He was given the world, and in return, the world was taken from him. The man who had given a voice to the loneliness of a generation died profoundly, unspeakably alone. The great tragedy of Elvis Presley is not that he died so young, it's that he died long before his heart stopped beating, a ghost haunting the jewel-encrusted prison of his own life. His music will live forever, a timeless testament to his genius. But it is the silence between the notes where his true story lies, a cautionary tale of a king, his crown, and the terrible, hidden price of a golden cage. The story of Elvis is more than just music and myth. It's a look into the very soul of fame and its cost. If you believe these hidden histories need to be told, subscribe to forever_Elvis_stories. There are more secrets in the shadows, waiting to be brought into the light.